welcome to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Sarah. It is another week, another Tuesday, and I am delighted to be with you to bring you another author interview. As we get started, I do want to remind you, as usual, to please like, follow, and subscribe on whatever platform you are either listening to or watching this episode on. Really does help the algorithm get this out to more readers such as yourself, and it is greatly appreciated. If you want to support the podcast in another way, you can do so by going to gsmcpodcast.info. There you can leave a tip or a donation, and if you would like, you can leave a question or a comment as well. I'm always happy to engage with questions or comments, and I will answer those at the beginning of the next episode after receiving them. So again, that is gsmcpodcast.info if you want to support the podcast in a monetary fashion. Every bit of support you give is greatly appreciated. It helps not only this podcast, but the network as a whole. And thank you, as always, for everything that you do to support the podcast. I hope you're having a great week so far, and I hope that you had a good weekend. I mentioned on Friday's episode that my husband's birthday was Thursday, so we just kind of made it a whole weekend-long, very quiet celebration. We were actually going to go to Spain on Saturday or Sunday, but then it rained all weekend, and we thought, we just don't feel like driving in the rain, so we didn't. We are a little over an hour from the Spain border, which... I've lived here almost 3 years, and it's still crazy to me that I can drive to Spain in an hour, because that's, well, I mean, I grew up in Montana. You can't drive anywhere in an hour. Certainly not to another country, although we're very close to Canada, where I grew up just 2 to 3 hours from Canada, so I could drive to another country in less than 5 hours. Not that long, but still, it seems very strange to me to be able to drive to Spain, but we did not. We just stayed home and hung out and caught up on some TV that we haven't watched in forever, and it was nice. So it was a very quiet weekend, but it was what he wanted, and he got very practical gifts this year by his request. I didn't go out and, buy him socks or underwear or something that he didn't want. No socks or underwear for his birthday. But yeah, very practical gifts, but things that he asked for, that he wanted. So I was happy to be able to get those for him, and they benefit both of us, which is not a bad thing. At any rate, let's talk about a book. I am speaking today with author Holly C. LaBarbera, excuse me. Quick side note, I told Holly this before we started recording. I thought LaBarbera was how you pronounce her name, and then of course I pronounce it incorrectly the first time I say it. But do you remember, if you're old enough, or if you watched it in syndication or on the Cartoon Network or wherever, Flintstones and many other cartoons that it created by Hanna-Barbera? As a kid, I thought it said Hanna-Barbera, and I thought it was either a woman named Hanna-Barbera or two women named Hannah and Barbara, and I thought that was the absolute coolest thing, that some of my favorite cartoons were created by women. And then I got older and found out that it was actually the last names of two men, and I was disillusioned. But I'm not disillusioned by Holly, and it did give me I got to learn as a kid, not only was Barbara not a man, or not a woman, but it was a man whose last name was Barbera, and helped me to learn to pronounce Holly's last name. So hey, everything helps in some way. Okay. Anyway, the book is called All I Know, and let me go ahead and give you a description of the book. Despite childhood trauma and tragedy, Kai Martin has never given up, rising from devastation to rebuild her life over and over again in this inspiring story of strength and resilience. Kai sees her life as a series of concentric circles, her twin brother Kade occupying the center sphere with her, their parents surrounding them in the next, and the Tyler family in the outer loop, a connection Kai plans to make official by someday marrying Josh Tyler. The Martins and Tylers share memorable times together, but under the surface, they are two dysfunctional families struggling with alcoholism, depression, and abuse, all of which leads to a horrifying event that knocks Kai off her axis and makes her doubt everything she thought she knew. Josh is there through it all, and Kai eventually gets the romance she dreamed of, embarking on a life of travel and adventure with the boy she always loved. Yet reality is more complicated than any childhood fantasy, and when painful family patterns are reenacted between them, Kai must decide how much of herself she is willing to sacrifice for Josh. Ultimately, Kai must confront the heartbreaking truth that as much as we try to help the people we love, we can only truly save ourselves. And that, as I said, is the description of All I Know. And it's everything that you just heard and so much more. I mean, that told you a lot, and yet there are so many more layers to this book. It is a book about, I mean, on the surface, you might think it's a romance between Kai and Josh, and in some ways it is, but it's a book about relationships of all kind, platonic, familial, um, your friends, your chosen family. It's a book about family, biological, found family, chosen family, etc. It's a book about two families that are very, very intertwined, and the ways in which that and the families themselves are both good and bad, and neither good nor bad. There's a lot of different layers, and Kai, of course, is at the center of it all, just trying to figure out how she is going to live this life and what she wants out of it and what her main goals might be and how those relationships fit into that plan or affect that plan, influence that plan. It's all that intertwined life stuff, right? So let's go ahead and let Holly talk more about the book and the writing of the book. Again, the book is called is called All I Know, and the author is Holly C. LaBarbera. Hi, Holly, and welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thanks, Sarah. I'm glad to be here.
I am glad to have you here. I am excited to talk about your book, All I Know. Before we get to that, though, if you would take just a moment to share a little bit about yourself so my listeners can get to know you.
Sure. So I, similar to Kai, my protagonist in the book, I was born in Hawaii. I grew up in New York, about an hour north of the city. I actually grew up in the house I created for Kai. So once you read it, that's my house. Um, I live outside of San Francisco in the Bay Area. I've been writing only for about a dozen years. Well, only formally writing for about a dozen years. I've always written letters and journaled and done other types of writing. And I was very lucky and grateful to have gotten in touch with a wonderful editor that helped me when I was just starting to write and helped me herself and then recommended this community of writers workshop in the Lake Tahoe area. And I went there in 2018 and met a bunch of wonderful writers, and just that helped so much with my growth and development, and found people to be in a writing group with and some other people just to have kind of collaborative support with. And so that's really helped me as I've been, writing. And for my day job, I am a psychotherapist. So I have a private practice of my own. I see adults, teenagers, couples, work with grief, depression, anxiety. I love my job. And then I'm also an adjunct professor at Santa Clara University's counseling psychology department. So I teach a class that guides graduate students as they're doing their internship year. So I help guide them through that.
Okay. So from that, I can hear, the house, but then there's a couple other things that I can tell that you've taken from your own experience to help incorporate into the story.
Yeah.
We can get to that later. So, give an overview of the story.
Okay. Well, so all I know is the story of this young woman who overcomes trauma and tragedy in her childhood to try and build this life with this boy she always loved. So there's this central love story, and then kind of around that, the book explores complexities of lots of different kinds of love, like within families, among friends, the love you might or might not have for yourself, and kind of how all of those experiences of relationships shape a person, which I've seen a lot in my job. I think it's primarily a story of strength and resilience. There's kind of a lot of difficult things that happen, but it's ultimately about kind of rising above all that and rebuilding your life over and over again. And hopefully, it's also about the power women have within themselves, and that often comes from being supported by other women. So Kai has a great relationship with her mom. She has some really great friends that help support her and encourage her and kind of help her tap into her own inner strength. So,
And in
yeah.
some ways, it's a little bit about chosen or found family as well, because both Kai and Josh, who is the boy, as you mentioned, have very difficult families of origin. There's some good things and there's some difficult things, but Kai has his other support system as well.
Yes, yes, definitely.
I mentioned family a few minutes ago, and you can see that it's already come up, and it is a very important centerpiece of this book. Well, it's a very important piece of this book. Maybe not fully centerpiece, but I'd say it is pretty central to the story. We're gonna take a break. That was a quick first segment, but we're gonna take our first break of this episode. And when we come back, Holly will be talking about the inspiration for this book. What made her decide to write about Kai's story? You are tuned in to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and my conversation with author Holly C. LaBarbera. We are talking about her novel, All I Know. And as we get back into that conversation, I do want to remind you very quickly once again that if you want to help the podcast, you can go to gsmcpodcast.info. There you can leave a tip or donation. All of your support is helpful, and we are very grateful for it. Again, that link is gsmcpodcast.info if you want to leave a tip or a donation for the podcast and the network as a whole. Before the break, we were talking about the overview of All I Know and already started talking a little bit about family and the importance of family within the story. Let's go ahead and return to the conversation with Holly. What was your initial inspiration for the story itself?
So I think there was kind of two different inspirations for me for this book. Initially, it started with me kind of thinking about a boy that I had a crush on when I was little, like a family friend. And I think as a writer, for me, a lot of it starts with what ifs, right? So I've written 3 books in various forms. All I know is the most complete of all of them. Obviously, it's published, so that's about as complete as you can get. And so there was this nugget of, that didn't go anywhere. That was just what normally happens when you have a crush on someone, but kind of this what if idea. So that was one way it started. And initially, I kind of thought the book was going to be a love story. And then it really ended up being more about Kai herself versus her personal journey. And that was more inspired by a lot of kind of themes and stories I hear from my clients and my friends, and just kind of people's struggles with mental health issues and both for themselves and for their family and how it affects all the people around them. And I feel like there's been a lot of very wrong, stigmatizing, bad representations of people struggling with mental health issues. And so I really kind of wanted to honor my clients and the stories. Obviously, this isn't any client story because that would be unethical, but it's kind of, you see themes and things that
Yeah.
recur for a lot of people. And so I just wanted to provide a more accurate representation.
Yeah. So I would imagine that was a conscious choice then, in that there's different levels of the way people deal with their trauma or with their families of origin. Therapy is a theme, but there's, I mean, there's unhealthier ways to deal with it from some of the
Absolutely. Right.
characters. So my point was, I imagine that was a conscious choice on your part.
Right, right. To kind of demonstrate there's addiction in the story, there's abuse, there's kind of reenacting the same things that happen, and then there's making a decision to try to actively do something different. And how do you do that? And so, yeah, that was definitely a choice. I also kind of use my knowledge to about resilience factors and what helps someone be more resilient, which a couple of those things are having a good enough parent, which for Kai is her mom, in my opinion, who kind of gives her a solid base to work from. And then having a community. Like she has, again, these one particular good friend, but there's a few good friends that she has, and that really help her move through the difficult things that happen.
Yeah.
So,
And
yeah.
you'd mentioned that it started out as more of a romance, and that would have been, that would have been a different story and probably a good story. But one thing I appreciated about Kai's story and Kai's and Josh's story is that it's not easy. With romances, you're going to get the happily ever after, it's good. They're going to have some rocky points, but they're going to get through it, right? In this
Mhm.
story, you're dealing with people in relationship with their own histories, their own past, trying to figure out how to make things work.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's interesting because since the book's been published, I've been talking to a lot of people that are reading it, and it's very mixed as far as the ending and how things all play out. And I love that. I mean, I didn't want to write a book where everyone knew how it would end and everyone felt exactly the same way about how it ended. I like having, I don't know if I would say controversy exactly, but like I like there being a debate about how things played out. And that was also kind of intentional.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit more about Kai. What about her as the main character do you feel will resonate with readers?
Um, I think well, I wrote her as a very precocious child, which I think people like. I mean, she's kind of always sassy and determined and has her own mind about things. She's a little sneaky. She's always kind of eavesdropping on people and trying to gather all the intel that she can. Um, but I think ultimately the fact that she does have this inner strength and she does um, take a lot of risks. I feel like she's fearless and afraid at the same time in throughout the book, which I think is very true for people. Um, she and Josh both kind of are these wounded souls that they hurt each other. Kai, I think, hurts other people, but we all do, and so she's
Yeah.
doing her best and she keeps trying to do better, but she also keeps doing dumb things throughout the book. And I think there's a lot of points people are like, oh, why does she keep doing, she gets stuck, but then she eventually gets out of it. And so yeah, I think that was a thing. I think in certain versions of the book, she got stuck longer and people were like, all right, enough of that already. And so I'm like, okay. But also I think my experience is people do get stuck for a while, and it does take longer than you'd like for them to get out of it. So I wanted a little bit of that in there. Um, and yeah, I think this idea of not always making the best decisions, but then kind of forgiving yourself and moving forward as best you can, I hope is that people can relate to that.
I can imagine that would be one of the challenges of being an author at times, is knowing that the reader, one, is going to bring their own experiences into a book with them, so they might not see it the same way that you're writing it. And two, the reader always knows more than the characters. And so the reader is always kind of that, why are you doing this again? What, this is good, So it's finding that balance of, yeah, okay, you're kind of annoying me right now, but I still really like your story arc and you as the main character.
Right. Yeah, that balance. Yeah. Because if you just like someone the whole time, it's pretty boring,
Yeah. So when you start writing a new story, do you tend to have a really solid character sketch in mind, especially for your main character, or does that evolve with the story or a combination?
Probably a combination. I think in my head, the character is pretty defined, like when I start writing. Um, I don't think it always comes out on the page, though, in the way I think it is. Like they're in my head, and so I assume things that the reader just knows was in my head. And then I have beta readers that are like, because I had versions of this where a lot of things happened to Kai, and Kai wasn't actively participating necessarily in her life. And I had, again, these writing group friends that were like, she needs to be proactive. Like, don't you want her to be strong? I'm like, she is strong. And they're like, okay, but that's not here. That's not on the page. And so it's like, oh, right. Okay. So I think it's more about, how do I get this knowledge of the character that I think is pretty firm in my head? How do I get that on the page?
Yeah.
So that's challenging.
Yeah. Any surprises, like secondary characters that took on bigger roles or just went in a direction you didn't want them or expect them to go?
Yeah. I think Josh became Josh is a pretty big character in the book for sure, but he became smaller than I expected. Like I said, to me, when I started, the book was like Kai and Josh's story. And then I was like, no, it's actually Kai's story, and Josh is a big part of it, but she's the main character, not him. It's not a shared main character. So that kind of evolved, and that was a little bit surprising, like kind of taking Josh, making him a little more background. And then I think Kai's best friend, Danny, filled in some of that space. So I think she became a bigger character. And part of that was that, and maybe this is true, I think I liked her more and more as I wrote her. And so I wrote her more into the story. And in my mind, she's maybe even an idealized character of everyone in the book, because I just feel like she's entirely the best friend I would want to have, like someone that's really honest, but always in your corner and really fun. So she was a fun character, and she got bigger as I was working through the book.
She really is kind of the epitome of everything you maybe want in a best friend, because she's both the get a grip friend and the ride or die friend. I mean, she can give you both, and she is very instrumental in helping Kai to come to some decisions in her life, like helping her see things in different ways or see things that maybe she's missing. She's a very good friend, and definitely her character helps to further the story in ways that it might, it probably would have been furthered in other ways, but it really is a great thing to have that best friend persona. So we're going to go ahead and take our second break of this episode. When we come back, we'll be talking more about Kai's relationship with her brother Kade, their relationship as twins. You are tuned in to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. Before the break, we were talking about Kai's best friend, one of the important relationships in this book. As we get started, we're going to move into another important relationship, and that is with her twin brother. I'm speaking, as you know, with author Holly C. LaBarbera about her novel All I Know, and let's get back to that conversation. Was Kai always a twin, or did that, yeah.
Kai was always a twin, and part of that is I'm super close with my brother and sister, and I think part of it, the scene, that the setting of the house, to me, well, let me back up for just a sec. So I don't feel like I am Kai at all. Like, I don't feel like we're character or personality wise very much the same, but a lot of the settings, a lot of the places Kai is, and a lot of kind of the surrounding experience I pulled from my life. But like her and her story don't feel like me in my life. But I will say, growing up in the house that I describe in the book, it's a very kind of isolated house, and it contributes to Kai and her brother Kade being really close.
Yeah.
And that was true for me and my siblings. You know, when you're out in the middle of the woods, in the middle of nowhere, this is your choice of who you can play with. So you get very close to those people. But I also think that the twin element in a lot of people's minds just makes them automatically closer, you know, and I've known a lot of twins, and sometimes that's true and sometimes that's not true. But I think as a storytelling technique, it just implies that there's this closeness that I wanted the reader to feel. So the twin just made the most sense for me to do that.
Yeah. And, you know, we never want to give too much away, but I think just stakes are higher, or, you know, with that relationship, you know, when it comes to.
Well, and I mean, the one part I think we can give away, because this comes out pretty early, is like Kade struggles with a lot of mental health issues. And so that's, I took a little inspiration. There's a number of books like this, but like Wally Lamb's I Know This Much Is True is a twin story where the one twin has
that book on your website. Okay.
I love that story. But it's this idea of like, how does that impact the sibling? You know, like, you love this person, you want to help them, and yet there's limitations to what you can do for someone that's struggling, and they kind of have to find a way to do that for themselves.
And that's present throughout their childhood. Kai is always I don't want to say stronger twin, but she's always the more forceful twin in terms of taking care of her brother, protecting her brother, kind of trying to make sure he's okay. And, you know, exactly what you're saying. How do you, if that's your role and that's what you've always done, and now you feel so helpless.
Right, when they're struggling. Yeah. You feel like you're failing. And I mean, that's essentially what Kai's trying to get over, or overcome. I don't want to overcome throughout her life, is how do you kind of take care of yourself and accept that you can't fix people, basically.
Exactly. You took a lot of experience from your own life and experiences, but did you do any particular research, maybe for the travel in the book or anything else?
Yeah, the couple things, the travel for sure. So some of the places I have been, and so I wrote those, but Kai and Josh kind of become these world travelers and kind of these adventure travelers, which their method of travel is not my method of travel. I don't want to be backpacking through the woods. And so that I did research, and which kind of is fun, because some people are like, have been to some of these places and like, oh, you wrote that. And I was like, yeah, no, I haven't been there. But so the places, the scenes, the settings, I did research some of that. I did also talk to a few people that were journalists and photojournalists in that time frame, to just see how the industry kind of works, because I wanted it, again, it's not a huge part of the book, but I also want it to be accurate when I'm writing it. Like, would they get those jobs, and could they do those jobs in the way that I wanted them to? And so I had to make some adjustments to that, because originally, no, the job I was envisioning didn't exist. So I made adjustments for that.
So because this takes place over a good chunk, a portion of Kai's life. I shouldn't say a good chunk because she's not really that old at the end. But from childhood forward through adulthood, you're writing, in the 80s and different points. But it also, she's living in New York City, 9/11. So was that always going to be part of the plot, or did you just kind of realize through the writing that she's there at that time?
Yeah, a little bit of both. I mean, the setting of the time frame of the book was always going to be that. And part of that was because I think there's something intrinsic about writing in a time before cell phones, like when you can't reach people as easily. And there's Kai does a lot of letter writing in the book, which I personally still write letters, but I'm one of, this very small percentage of people that do. So I wanted that to be more realistic, that was part of the book. And I think there's like a nostalgia just to writing something in the past. So that was always intentional. There's this thing about 9/11 that a friend said to me once who was living in the city at the time. And she described her marriage at one point as like, we were one of those 9/11 couples that like come together right after because people were trying to grasp onto hope after that. Yeah. And I didn't know that was a thing, but that was a thing for people living in New York City. And so that kind of, okay, like I want that then to be a center point. So I did kind of adjust Kai's age at a point so that she would be a certain age on 9/11 and be in the city. But she was always going to kind of be in the city around that time. So and I think if you're writing a book about destruction and rebuilding, 9/11 is a good example of that.
Yeah. Yeah. And it does. Yeah. Again, I'm trying not to give stuff away, but I'm like, yes, and never mind.
I mean, I hope it's not I didn't want it to be like gratuitous or anything.
Right. I'm just thinking of a direction the plot goes that, it's not a huge plot point, but again, you don't want to give everything away. And I'm glad you brought up the letter writing because that made me very nostalgic. Handwriting makes my hand cramp anymore. Everything on computers and phones, but I was thinking of working at a summer camp as a camp counselor in the 90s and all the letters, because we were in the middle of absolute nowhere. That's the only way you could communicate was letter writing. And I mean, I wrote letters before that too, because I'm a Gen Xer, but that was very nostalgic for me, was the letter writing.
Well, and especially Josh is away at camp when he writes to Kai at one point. So like that was true for you too. So
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I love writing letters. I was pen pals with my grandma my whole life until she died. And when she died, my mom sent me some of the letters that she had kept that I had written to her. And I kept some of the letters she wrote to me. And so that's just fun and like silly. Some of the things I wrote to her about the 8th grade boys that I liked. Like, okay, why did my grandma care about that? But I think she did.
Fun to read.
Yeah.
But getting the mail is not exciting anymore. Absolutely.
Now it's all junk and bills and whatever, right?
Yeah, it's more of a chore than like, oh, I'm gonna go get the mail.
Yeah. Well, and even my adult kids don't. I'm like, you need to go check your mailbox. Like I mailed you something. And they're like, oh, all right.
Oh, really? Why? Yeah.
Right, exactly.
What draws you to writing literary fiction?
I think what draws me to fiction generally is like writing wise or reading wise, is because of my job, I hear all these really hard true stories. And so when I read like nonfiction as far as memoir or something like that, like it's hard for me because then I know that's like a real person suffering, and that's kind of what I deal with all day long. And so I like stories like that. I like stories that make me cry or make me really emote, like have a lot of emotion. I love that. And it's easier for me when I know it's not actually true, even though some of it obviously comes from things that are true. But I think that little bit of distance of like fiction just makes it easier for me to digest a little bit. And yeah, I think I've just always been about stories, even though I didn't write my whole life, like formally write, but again, bringing up my grandma again, but my grandma, my mom just really gave me this love of reading, and I've always loved reading my whole life. And I love movies and I love plays, and I just love being immersed in a story. And I think that's part of what drew me to being a therapist too, is I love hearing people's stories and trying to help them find meaning in their stories, or like themes and patterns. And um, so yeah, I'm just all about stories. And I think that the fictional aspect just also provides some freedom,
Mhm.
Not,
Yeah.
you don't have to stick to what actually happened. You can decide.
Yeah, exactly. There's a little separation and a little bit more control.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Totally.
Makes perfect sense. I mean, books, I suppose, whether you're reading or writing them, offer certain amounts of escape. And so if you are dealing with stories of people's lives in everyday life, then fiction might be I don't want to say better, but a different route to take in in other aspects of your life. I mean, it does make a lot of sense to me, so why not? And I'm going to assume, as listeners or watchers of this podcast, you are also lovers of story, so you can probably relate to Holly as well in this case. But we're going to go ahead and take another break. When we come back, we'll be talking about works in progress, what Holly's working on now. You are tuned in to the GSMC Book Review podcast, and I will be right back. Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review podcast and my conversation with Holly C. LaBarbera. We were talking before the break. She was talking before the break about what draws her to writing literary fiction and her love of stories, etc. Let's go ahead and return to that conversation with Holly. Are you working on anything new currently?
I am. I'm very excited about the new book. I have a almost good enough first draft to send to some beta reader friends of mine. But this is a book, this new book opens with a woman who is watching her ex-husband's new wife kill him. So that's how the book opens.
Jeez.
And she's killing him in this plot that this woman has kind of put into motion. So she's not actually killing her ex-husband, but she definitely plays a part in making that happen. And so then it kind of goes back in time, and we see it's 2 years. So this starts and then we go 2 years past, and how did we get to this point? And it's told from three different viewpoints. So it's the woman watching the murder, the husband that ends up dead, and their teenage daughter. And so it kind of alternates viewpoints from those three. And so I'm excited about that one. It's very different, but there's some similarities with All I Know. So
Yeah. Some new challenges writing from different points of view.
definitely. Yeah. Yeah. A different time period. So yeah. A little more like Gone Girl kind of thriller, or Girl on the
Yeah.
Train kind of
Yeah.
vibe. Yeah.
Yeah. What made you decide to write for publication? Since you haven't always written, you said, although letter writing I think would count.
Yeah. And journaling. But yeah, no, it was Well, so when I wrote my first book, which this is actually the second book I wrote, but my kids were getting older. One had already gone off to college. My second was leaving for college, with the third to be right behind him. And it just felt like there was this kind of gaping hole I could just see opening up in my life. And I I think because people were leaving, I just felt like I needed to invent new people to enter my life. And I had always kind of played with, so saying I never formally wrote, I had a couple scenes from the initial book was called 5 Days, and it will end up being, so the teenage girl in the book I'm writing right now is going to grow up to be my main character in 5 days, which is a switch for that character, which is going to make that book way better. Because that book, I wrote it, I loved it, but there was always some problem with it. So I think this is the problem, is I didn't have a good sense of the main character. And
Mhm.
so now this person will grow up to be the main character, which is going to make that book much better when I rewrite that. Um, but I had always had scenes that I had written for that story, but never more than that. Like it had never blossomed into anything. And I was very busy and just didn't really even pay much attention to watering that idea. So then when this happened and I was feeling this kind of I guess grief. I mean, I guess there was a grief and people, my kids growing up and leaving, and deciding to kind of fill that with trying to write. And then that book kind of just poured out of me. Once I started writing it, it just like, it was very quick. That first draft came pretty quickly and just got me excited about the process. And then, went to these conferences, and then this story, All I Know, became like more front and center. So, yeah. And then once it was written, I mean, then you want to publish it, right? Like you want to share it and have other people read it. So,
Yeah.
uh, and that's impossibly hard to have happen. So, I mean, it's extremely difficult. I queried between the two books because I did try to get the first one published and then realized it wasn't really publishable in its current form. Um, but I mean, over 100 agents and stuff that I've queried, and
Yeah.
just decided to do it myself. So, yeah.
From this experience, then, what would be your main advice for someone kind of like you who has a story and is working through the process?
Yeah. For me, the best thing is to develop a community of writers. So I talk about kind of my capital C community of writers, which is what this workshop was called. It's called the Community of Writers Workshop. And then my lowercase c, like my community of writers that I met. And I think that's been important to me all throughout my life. Like when I first had my first child, I joined a mommy and me group, and that was my community. And I'm still friends with a lot of them. I've been in a book club for like over 20 years. So that's like my community of readers. And so it's always been a part for me of like in making a group of people. I had started a networking group of therapists when I started being a therapist that we still meet up. And so developing that group of writers that, whether that was reading each other's stuff and giving feedback or just kind of venting to each other about how difficult publishing is, and ideas of, oh, I heard this agent is looking for new people, or so practical things about publishing, or practical things about the writing, or just even talking about getting stuck, or writer's block, or how do I find the time, other things have taken over, how do I get back to, just actually yesterday morning I was on Zoom with one of my friends that lives in Colorado, but I met in Lake Tahoe, and um, we were just trying to get each other back on track, and working on our stuff. So um, I think having people to support you along the way is very, very important.
Yeah. And a little bit of accountability as well. I
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, being part of a writing group, um, for years we met like every month or every other month at the outside. And so it's like, okay, well, I have to have pages to give to people. So like, you better write something. And Yeah,
Yeah.
the accountability is huge. Yeah.
So this question is always hard because it's like me making you choose your favorite child, but favorite books, favorite authors, what are your go-tos?
Yeah. Well, so my favorite book of all time is John Irving's A Prayer for Owen Meany.
Mhm.
Um, I love John Irving books in general. I think he was my first favorite writer. Um, and again, he has these like very complicated characters that are a little bit weird and kind of bizarre, but anyway, I like that. I already said Wally Lamb, but I love all of Wally Lamb's books. I love Anne Patchett. Bel Canto is one of my favorite books. And I think like newer authors, I don't know if they're new, but I love Celeste Ng. I love Emily St. John Mandel. I just finished her Station 11 and she wrote Sea of Tranquility. Those are fabulous books. I like kind of weird books sometimes. I like Erin Morgenstern, The Night Circus and
Mhm.
Starless Sea. I love both of those books. But then I also just love I also will read anything by Taylor Jenkins Reid, like Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo and Malibu Rising. I love those, which is just kind of a little bit more straight up. I don't know. They're not really love story. I mean, they are love stories and they're not, but um,
Yeah.
yeah. So
All
yeah.
right.
So this is I avoided picking one. I listed a whole bunch.
As you should. Who can pick one? That's crazy
Right.
talk.
Totally. Yeah.
If people want to learn more about you and the book, tell them your website and any social media that you're active on, and they can find you.
Yeah, so the website is hollylabarbera.com. Um, and I do a blog from time to time, so you can check that out on the website. I'm on Instagram, it's Holly Tells a Tale, all one word is my Instagram, and on Facebook, it's Holly LaBarbera. So, um, yeah, Instagram and Facebook are what I'm on most.
Thank you.
And then I don't love social media, so I'm not on even on them all that much, but I am on
It
there.
takes time. Go find Holly on social media. Go find her website. Always, it's always good to go support the authors that you know and like and follow them and find out what's going on and finding out when new books are coming out. So go do all of those things. We are almost ready to wrap things up with Holly, but we're going to take one more break first. And when we come back, we'll be talking more about family, more about its relationship in this book, Families of Origin specifically, and how they can affect our lives and decisions sometimes, even as adults. You are tuned in to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back. Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and the conclusion of my conversation with author Holly C. LaBarbera. Before the break, we were talking about internet presence, websites, social media, etc. Let's go ahead and finish up this lovely conversation. Holly, is there anything that we haven't covered that you wanted to make sure you highlighted or talked about during this time?
else? Um, I think that maybe just the one thing more about the book that we didn't really talk, I mean, we mentioned a little bit, but I do feel like an important part of the book for me is like the two families, like the Kai's family and Josh's family, because they're intertwined families. And um I really wanted to kind of develop this idea of like how our families of origin affect us as adults and how those relationships affect adult relationships. Um, but then also just the experience of like these dysfunctional families and that are sometimes, I mean, they have a lot of fun together and there's a lot of like really good times. And then there's a lot of dysfunction, a lot of the dads are alcoholics and there's abuse here and there, emotional, physical. And so I think that this idea of things being really messy and that you can't just say like, even, I mean, I will say Josh's dad is probably the most bad guy in the book. But there was a version where he was like there was no redeeming quality in him at
Mm,
all. And I was like, I don't want a character like that because I don't believe there are people like that.
yeah,
Or I don't know. I'm starting to think maybe there are some people like that, but in general, I don't think people are all one thing, right? And so I wanted, and I think in a version, Kai's mom was very much like the amazing woman, and I feel like that's a problem too, because
yeah,
women are perfect. There's not this perfect mom idea. So I wanted everybody to be kind of messy and complex, and the families to be messy and complex. And I want it to be hard for the reader to hate anyone, and hard for them to just love anyone without like, oh, but I didn't really like that.
yeah.
So,
Well, I think that another way that you do that and bring up another good point is that between the two families, there's 6 children, and the different parents, they have the same parents, but the different experiences between Josh and his youngest sibling and the way they view their parents, or his other siblings and the way they view their parents, because sometimes you grow up in the same family and it feels like you have completely different parents. I have this experience with my siblings.
yeah, definitely. Absolutely. And Kai and Cade are treated very differently by their father, particularly. But yeah, absolutely. And yeah, so yeah, I think I just wanted to call that out, like that I'm trying to make things messy. I don't know, because I think people try to avoid that, like, and try to make things be one thing. And I have never experienced the world like that. So,
Right. Yeah. Well, people aren't black and white, so why should characters be?
right, right. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to talk to me about the book and everything else. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for having me. It was wonderful to have the conversation. So, thanks.
Thank you so much to Holly for talking to me about All I Know and families of origin and relationships and everything else that we covered. I really appreciate it, of course. And as I said at the beginning, this book is so beautifully written about so many different levels of relationship. And if you're a fan of literary fiction, if you're a fan of really interesting but very complex characters, not just Kai, but also Josh, and even their families of origin, which we learn a little bit about each of the members of those families, just very nuanced, layered, complex characters, relationships, families, etc. So if you're a fan of that type of writing and that type of story, then you definitely want to check out this book and get to know Holly as an author a little bit. So thank you so much for joining me for this episode. As you know, normally at this point, I ask you to join me for the next episode, which I am doing now. Always, please join me for my next episode, for my next author interview. I usually tell you what that interview will be, and I don't want to give you incorrect information. So I'm not going to put up the author and cover as I normally do, because I mentioned that I had 2 interviews scheduled over the weekend. and was waiting to hear about a reschedule for one of them. Still waiting to hear about that. It may happen, and I may be posting that episode on Friday, or it might not happen in time, in which case I'll be posting my usual episode on Tuesday with this coming weekend's author and moving that interview to another time. It's a whole moving pieces kind of thing right now, but I don't want to tell you this is going to be my next interview and then have you tune into the next episode and be confused. But this does bring me to a good point, a point that I make at the end of every episode, but here's why. That episode could be Friday. That episode could be Tuesday. It will definitely be Tuesday, but there might be a Friday episode. So if you like, follow, and subscribe on whatever platform you are listening to this episode on, listening or watching this episode on, you're going to be notified. If you hit the notification as well, you're going to be notified when there is a new episode, and then you can take the guesswork out of the process. See how easy that is? Also, if you would like to support the podcast, you can leave a positive review. That really, really helps the algorithm, helps the whole world of the internet to get this podcast out to more readers such as yourselves. As I say many times, every episode, your support is greatly appreciated. I am very grateful for you, for all the support. Listening, watching, supporting however you do and can is greatly appreciated. You can also follow the podcast on social media, Facebook, X, Instagram, and TikTok. You can find it on all of those platforms, and I love hearing from you on social media as well. So come find the podcast, let me know what you're thinking book-wise and what you're reading, what you want to read. 2024 is about to wrap up. Did you meet your reading goals? Did you exceed your reading goals? It's okay if you neither met nor exceeded. If you didn't read as many books as you wanted to. If you didn't read hardly any books. Every year is different. And lots of things affect how many books we read. But come tell me what your 2024 looked like in terms of books as we are starting to wrap up yet another year. At any rate, I hope that you're having a great week so far. Whatever this week throws at you, though, I hope it offers you plenty of time to get yourself lost in a good book. Thank you so much, and I'll see you next time.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't hit yet, damn, ain't that great. I don't wanna go to